Atomic Heart is a very intriguing game. Set in 1955 in a technologically advanced Soviet Union, it's a retro-futuristic first-person action game with an emphasis on crafting, scavenging, and bare-knuckle action. This BioShock-inspired title packs a unique setting and beautiful vistas too, powered by Unreal Engine 4. At the same time, Atomic Heart is an ambitious, content-rich game from a new development studio with all the pitfalls that can bring. So does the game live up to its lofty expectations? And how does performance fare across current-gen consoles and PC? Atomic Heart's visuals revolve around a retrofuturistic visual language, essentially a view of the future as someone in the past might have imagined it. The game's Soviet Union is a scientific powerhouse, with monumental structures, floating cities, advanced robotics, and a quasi-magical technology called polymerization undergirding it all. That's all conveyed through a mishmash of 20th century modernist architectural styles. Some environments look flat and austere, while others have a bit of a more ornate look. And the game skews towards materials processes that would have been common during the mid-century time period, so plastics are basically absent, with dense metalwork taking its place. Each area in Atomic Heart is packed with high-quality artwork. There are bold plazas, dilapidated offices, shiny exhibits, and comfortably appointed theaters, and they all manage to keep a distinct identity without seeming out of place within the larger world. Expect to see a lot of unique assets and novel structures in each area, keeping the game feeling fresh throughout. And that extends to the 2D art as well, which is heavily inspired by Soviet illustrations from the period. Atomic Heart typically has quite nice lighting as well. The game uses a typical mix of contemporary techniques, blending baked lighting techniques along with real-time lights and shadow maps, but the final results often impress regardless. Some areas have stark, almost uniform lighting, while others are sparse and more contrasty, and the ambient lighting is detailed enough to produce a pleasing result regardless. The lighting response off each surface feels appropriate as well, particularly on the metals and stonework that dominate the game's interiors. Every so often, though, you'll emerge from the game's interior complexes and come out into fresh air. Atomic Heart isn't an open-world game exactly, but it does feature expansive gameplay spaces to traverse in between objectives. These forested areas often look excellent, with rich foliage, a minimum of pop-in, and good distant detail. So Atomic Heart does usually look quite attractive. I'm particularly fond of some of the game's set-piece interior spaces, which feature unique assets and some very striking visual design. But if you poke around a bit, you can spot some obvious issues and flaws that make the game feel a tad inconsistent. The game's lighting can look very basic at times, specifically in the more open environments, which often seem like they're basically lacking GI information altogether. This goes beyond the typical issues with larger scale light occlusion that we tend to see in a lot of modern games, though those problems are evident here as well. Outdoor areas tend to have minimally detailed indirect lighting, so any larger shadowed region has very uniform color. In some areas, the lighting almost seems broken as a result, with perfectly level, grayish shading that makes the game look like old offline CG. Getting accurate lighting within large game spaces is challenging, but Atomic Heart does a poor job here, despite featuring a fixed time of day. The game relies heavily on screen space effects, as you might expect, which generally works well enough. There's the typical SSR and SSAO, along with screen space shadows that are most prominently featured on the game's finer foliage elements. But the SSR is used sort of inappropriately, in particular on glass surfaces that run parallel to the player viewport, where screen space information is usually absent or partially occluded. This produces some really obtrusive and off-putting artifacts. Plus, the game doesn't seem to make effective use of cube maps as a fallback when SSR information is absent, relying instead on textures that don't adjust properly to the player perspective. Perhaps to ease CPU load, Atomic Heart makes very liberal use of reduced rate animations for any objects that are more than a few feet from the player. On current-gen consoles, this isn't hugely noticeable at a glance, but if you stop for just a second, it becomes pretty obvious and it sort of ruins the appearance of certain cutscenes. And there are a few areas where the cutback animation is extremely distracting, like with the loaders in this scene. Other animations appear to be running at a reduced rate at first, but on closer inspection actually seem to suffer from issues with interpolation, lurching disproportionately every few frames. Beyond those issues, Atomic Heart is an attractive game, albeit a very cross-gen one. Don't go in expecting super detailed assets or advanced ray tracing techniques. That becomes abundantly clear if we take a quick peek at the game running on a last-gen console, which has a very similar appearance and basic visual features. Instead, current-gen consoles get image quality boosts over last-gen hardware, plus a 60 FPS framerate target in their sole visual mode. Although there are some caveats to that, as we'll get to in a moment. On PS5 and Xbox Series X, image quality is clean and sharp throughout. We're looking at a 2160p typical resolution here, backed up by what appears to be Unreal's TAA. There is some dynamic resolution in play, but it's quite conservative. This is usually a full 4K. It's hard to fault the presentation on either platform, at least in terms of basic geometric and texture resolve. The game is detailed and stable. Series S looks quite a bit softer in comparison, resolving less detail but still usually looking reasonably coherent. Pixel counts are reduced by about 3/4 here, coming in at 1080p in most shots, with some minor dips below, but again mostly clocking in at that full 1080. It doesn't look bad at all, but the magnitude of the resolution hit is pretty large, and that's not the only cutback on Series S. Geometric and texture detail is subtly downgraded on Microsoft's junior current-gen console, which is most visible on the player hand and weapon, but is present across a wide range of models if you do look closely. Foliage density gets mildly pared back too, both up close and at a distance. Shadow filtering is scaled back, producing more aliased-looking shadows from distant geometry, and the Series S appears to have no motion blur whatsoever, oddly enough, despite a toggle for it in the settings. None of these are particularly harsh compromises, but they do stick out in head-to-head comparisons. The PS5 and Series X seem to be like for like in general visual settings though, with matching graphics across a variety of shots. Performance, unfortunately, is a different story. Let's start with PS5. Frame rates aren't perfect here, but we're not too far from a stable 60 FPS. Certain cutscenes can cause significant dips, but in general gameplay 1 or 2 frame drops are more common, with prolonged dips a relative rarity. The rest of the time the game sails along at a smooth 60 FPS it seems, at least in my own testing, without much in the way of impactful performance issues. Series X is a different story. The game frequently drops frames during combat, traversal, and on-camera movement. Sometimes these are momentary, but they can be severe, like in this sequence during the game's intro. The game also suffers from occasional stutters, usually between about 50 and 100 milliseconds. Atomic Heart does maintain 60 FPS most of the time on Series X, but the framerate and frame time issues are intrusive and make it feel a lot less stable than it really ought to be. Series S behaves a lot like Series X, just a little bit worse. Framerate dips tend to be more prolonged, with plenty of dropped frames during many sequences. It doesn't appear to stutter quite as frequently as Series X, but it does fall short of 60 FPS more often. Performance in Atomic Heart is very much in flux though, with multiple patches arriving over the past few days, seeking to address performance. With the earlier Day 1 patch installed, for instance, Xbox Series consoles had massive stutters during traversal. I logged a gigantic 1.35 second stutter in one such instance on Series S, a lengthy pause that came absolutely out of nowhere. The situation is much improved as of the latest patch, but the Xboxes still need more work. Finally, I do have to mention some bugs that I encountered on the console versions. Foliage has a habit of popping in and out of existence in certain areas, at least on the Xboxes. There was also a period of a few minutes during my Xbox Series X gameplay where I couldn't pause the game, no matter how many times I tried. The game would simply flash part of the pause screen for one frame, and then get back to gameplay. These projector screen panels also seem bugged on Xbox but are totally fine on PlayStation. Notice how they play back a video sequence on PS5 along with a lighting effect, while the Series X is missing the video entirely. Judging from online reports, I'm probably just scratching the surface here, so do be warned. So that's Atomic Heart on current-gen consoles, but what about PC? There is something that we have to get out of the way first. Atomic Heart was one of the first games announced to use ray tracing, with the developer promising RTAO, RT Reflections, and RT Shadows all the way back in August of 2018. In 2019, a downloadable demo of the game featuring ray tracing was released, and in the interim the game has been heavily promoted, advertising its ray tracing capabilities. But the feature seems to have been unceremoniously dropped for the game's launch. There was some initial confusion online about the presence of good-looking reflection effects in the game's introduction sequence, but these appear to be planar reflections, not ray-traced reflections, and appear on all platforms, including the last-gen consoles. There's some indication that the RT features will return at some indefinite point in the future, hopefully soon. But for now, the PC version doesn't pack the impressive ray tracing effects that were previously shown. First impressions upon actually booting the PC release are good at least, as the game offers a shader pre-compilation step on launch. This is a very welcome sign considering this is a DirectX 12 based Unreal Engine 4 title, which would otherwise very likely suffer from serious shader compilation stutter. On my i7-13700K and RTX 4090 based system, this took a relatively speedy 3 minutes and 8 seconds. I played through roughly the first hour of the game at 4K 60 at maximum settings and had a mostly stutter-free experience. There were 3 50 millisecond stutters throughout my initial capture, which seemed related to shader compilation and didn't reoccur when I tried to replicate them. There was a brief clutch of dropped frames during an early cutscene, though again this disappeared on a second run, and there were a few other minor cutscene framerate drops as well. It seems like perhaps the pre-compilation is a bit under-inclusive at the moment, though the stuttering issues are far less severe here than in most other UE4 titles. Comparing the maxed out PC version at native 4K against Xbox Series X, we get a pretty solid range of visual improvements. Shadow resolution is increased with no apparent aliasing and a much cleaner representation of fine detail. Foliage density is increased both up close and at range. Screen space reflections are upgraded, more realistically diffusing along rougher surfaces. Plus, the ambient shading looks much more realistic to my eyes, particularly in the game's outdoor areas. This appears to largely stem from better SSAO, which offers thicker coverage with a fairly accurate look. So the console's key visual fault is addressed to some degree on PC, even in its current rasterization-only state. I'm sure there are other upgrades, but those are the ones that stood out in head-to-head comparisons. Unfortunately, you can't overcome all the faults of the console releases. The reduced rate animation is still pretty obnoxious sometimes, even on the highest settings, but it's definitely a substantially better looking game. There are a handful of PC exclusive features here as well. On the image quality front, DLSS 2 is here alongside FSR 1. DLSS 2 quality at 4K generally offers a cleaner image than native resolution rendering with TAA, with a more stable resolve of fine details. DLSS balanced and performance are slightly less clean, but still look preferable to my eyes over a native 4K presentation. DLSS 2 comes highly recommended here, and I was able to hit a solid 4K 120 with DLSS quality on my 4090 based system, which looked and felt fantastic. FSR 1 offers a decent enough solution to scale rendering resolution without affecting the UI, but beyond that it's not particularly exciting, with progressively poorer image quality in line with base rendering resolution. It's a shame that FSR 2 isn't here. Again, this is another feature that was promised, but isn't in the game quite yet. DLSS 3 frame generation is also available, which produces good results here, I would say. Even using it to bring 30 FPS to 60 FPS as I'm doing here looks pretty solid and holds up well enough, at least at a typical TV viewing distance. You can pick it apart in stills, of course, but the moment-to-moment visual experience is very similar to a conventional 60 FPS presentation. Some of the in-game UI elements do exhibit problems with frame generation enabled though, specifically the waypoint markers. These tend to artifact quite badly in the generated frames, and look jittery and unstable in motion. Other PC settings are fairly straightforward and mostly perform as advertised. The final omission at the moment is the lack of built-in ultrawide support, although this is something that again is promised for future releases. Beyond the technical minutiae, Atomic Heart is at least a pretty satisfying game to play. The combat works reasonably well, with clearly telegraphed enemy attacks and solid hit reactions. The large-scale environmental challenges are cleverly constructed and fun to solve, and the world itself is full of mystery and excitement. The relentless volume of enemies and relative scarcity of ammunition can make the action feel a little bit unbalanced at times, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is consistently fun for those who can stomach the game's difficulty swings. I also loved scrounging around for loot with the game's telekinesis-style powers, which is a very nice touch. I was somewhat less impressed with the game's scripting and plot. The visual world building is often excellent, but the storytelling is unnecessarily convoluted and based around a series of quasi-magical technologies that are poorly explained. It certainly doesn't help that the main character is written like Duke Nukem and doesn't sound very far from him either, a gruff, constantly swearing character who speaks far too often.
You don't need it anymore, and that f***ing Rafik on the train is busting my balls.
You saw a Rafik?
Talking to that metal moron is making me want to kill myself. So how about that pass?
Plus, the game's approach to its English language localization is a little bit baffling. Most actors speak in UK or American English accents, which is an odd if defensible choice, but there are characters that speak in German accented English and Eastern European accents as well. Why not simply commit to one approach in terms of accents instead of blending region-appropriate accents and English native ones? As long as you don't take Atomic Heart too seriously, it is a fun ride at least. Visually it's attractive, but there are some issues. I love the look of some of the interiors, but the lighting issues outdoors are hard to overlook, and some of the screen space artifacts annoy. The PC version has welcome visual boosts that partially resolve these issues, though its key ray-traced enhancements are still to come. Performance isn't perfect on any current-gen console platform, but the Xbox Series consoles fare significantly worse than PS5. A capable PC is ultimately your best bet for solid frame rates, with pretty good rendering efficiency and minimal shader compilation stutter. Atomic Heart is an inconsistent, bold game that has exciting highs, but some serious lows as well. Perhaps the best approach is to wait and see what future patches bring, but for now the PlayStation 5 and PC releases offer the best experience. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.